Emily stood at the very end of the pier. Beneath her, the wood groaned, salt-crusted and weathered by decades of spray. She shifted her weight, the rough planks biting into the soles of her boots. Below, the morning tide surged, a relentless gray force dragging pebbles back into the deep, churning abyss. She watched the water, her eyes tracing the line where the sea met the sky, a horizon that had remained unchanged for 20 years. She held a worn paperback against her chest, her fingers locked around the spine until her knuckles turned white. She tried to focus on the words, to lose herself in the ink, but the rhythm of the waves was louder. It was a constant, hollow thrumming that matched the stillness of her own life. Every morning was the same. Every tide pulled away, leaving nothing behind but the same empty stretch of sand and the same suffocating silence. She looked out at the vast, gray expanse, feeling the weight of 2 decades spent waiting for a ripple, a shift, anything to break the monotony. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, whipping against her face. She stood motionless, trapped in the rhythm of the tide, waiting for the stillness to finally break. Emily stood at the very end of the pier. Beneath her, the wood groaned, salt-crusted and weathered by decades of spray. She shifted her weight, the rough planks biting into the soles of her boots. Below, the morning tide surged, a relentless gray force dragging pebbles back into the deep, churning abyss. She watched the water, her eyes tracing the line where the sea met the sky, a horizon that had remained unchanged for 20 years. She held a worn paperback against her chest, her fingers locked around the spine until her knuckles turned white. She tried to focus on the words, to lose herself in the ink, but the rhythm of the waves was louder. It was a constant, hollow thrumming that matched the stillness of her own life. Every morning was the same. Every tide pulled away, leaving nothing behind but the same empty stretch of sand and the same suffocating silence. She looked out at the vast, gray expanse, feeling the weight of 2 decades spent waiting for a ripple, a shift, anything to break the monotony. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, whipping against her face. She stood motionless, trapped in the rhythm of the tide, waiting for the stillness to finally break. Emily stood at the very end of the pier. Beneath her, the wood groaned, salt-crusted and weathered by decades of spray. She shifted her weight, the rough planks biting into the soles of her boots. Below, the morning tide surged, a relentless gray force dragging pebbles back into the deep, churning abyss. She watched the water, her eyes tracing the line where the sea met the sky, a horizon that had remained unchanged for 20 years. She held a worn paperback against her chest, her fingers locked around the spine until her knuckles turned white. She tried to focus on the words, to lose herself in the ink, but the rhythm of the waves was louder. It was a constant, hollow thrumming that matched the stillness of her own life. Every morning was the same. Every tide pulled away, leaving nothing behind but the same empty stretch of sand and the same suffocating silence. She looked out at the vast, gray expanse, feeling the weight of 2 decades spent waiting for a ripple, a shift, anything to break the monotony. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, whipping against her face. She stood motionless, trapped in the rhythm of the tide, waiting for the stillness to finally break. The wind shifted. It did not just blow, it lunged. A violent gust tore the paperback from her grip, the pages fluttering like a trapped bird before the volume skidded across the salt-slicked planks. Emily reached out, her fingers grasping at empty air, but the book was already sliding toward the gap. It tumbled, teetering on the very edge of the abyss. Then, a shadow moved. A man surged forward, his boots thudding hard against the wood. He dropped to his knees, his hand slamming down onto the cover just as it tipped over the side. He pinned it there, the force of his movement vibrating through the pier. Emily stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, watching the sudden intrusion of motion into her static world. The man stood up, brushing a dusting of sand from the paper cover. He looked toward the horizon, his gaze steady. "I think this story is better than mine," he said. Emily stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the book. She took it, and for a heartbeat, her fingers brushed his calloused palm. The contact was sharp, a jolt of heat that cut through the cold, salt air. She looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. "Maybe it is a story not yet written," she replied. The cafe became their sanctuary, a small corner shielded from the relentless coastal wind. The air inside smelled of roasted beans and damp wool. Daniel claimed the table near the window, his laptop screen casting a soft, flickering light against the wood. He worked in bursts, his fingers tapping a rhythmic cadence that filled the gaps between the clinking of porcelain cups. Emily sat opposite him, her charcoal pencil moving across the paper in long, deliberate strokes. She captured the jagged edges of the cliffs. They rarely spoke in full sentences. Instead, they traded observations like currency. "The tide is turning earlier today," he would murmur. "The light is sharper on the rocks," she would respond, her eyes fixed on the page. It was a language of fragments. They existed in a shared orbit, the scratch of her pencil and the click of his keys weaving into a new, steady pattern. For the first time in 20 years, the silence did not feel like a void. It felt like a space being filled, one word and one line at a time. The sun bled orange across the water, casting long, distorted shadows through the cafe window. Daniel stopped typing. The silence that followed was heavy, stripped of its usual comfort. He closed the laptop with a sharp, final click that made Emily look up from her sketch. He pushed a notebook toward her, the paper stark and white under the dimming light. "I have been stuck for months," he admitted, his finger tapping the empty pages. "Watching you walk the beach every morning gave me the first sentence." Emily looked at the notebook, then out at the vast, empty sea. She saw the horizon she had watched for 20 years, but it no longer looked like a barrier. She realized then that her fear of leaving this town was just a fear of the blank page, a terror of starting something she could not control. The realization settled in her chest, solid and cold. Before it ignited, she reached out and took the pen. She did not hesitate. The tip touched the paper, and she began to write. Daniel watched her, his own pen hovering before he joined her. The sound of their pens scratching in unison filled the room. The deadline arrived not with a warning, but with the sudden, jarring pressure of a storm front. The air in the room shifted, turning thin and cold. Daniel stood up, his movements no longer fluid or measured, but sharp and final. He pulled his suitcase from the corner, the metal zipper rasping against the quiet like a blade. He did not look at the notebook. He did not look at the desk. He moved with a mechanical efficiency, clearing the table of his laptop, his pens, and his scattered notes. Each item he tucked away felt like a deliberate erasure of the last few weeks. Emily stood by the window, watching the reflection of his haste in the glass. He worked with his back to her, his shoulders set in a rigid line that discouraged interruption. He reached the counter, emptied his pockets, and placed his keys down. The sound of the metal hitting the wood was final, a dull thud that echoed in the hollow space between them. He grabbed the handle of his bag, turned, and walked toward the door. The door swung open, letting in a gust of salt air that scattered the loose papers on the desk. Then, the heavy wood clicked shut. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute, suffocating, and entirely empty. The beach was a desolate stretch of gray sand and churning foam. Emily walked the shoreline alone, her boots sinking into the wet, heavy earth with every step. The wind had picked up, a sharp, biting gale that lashed at her skin and pulled at her hair, forcing her to squint against the spray. She did not look for shelter. She walked until her legs burned, heading toward the pier where the wood still bore the salt-crusted marks of their first encounter. She stopped there. The tide was pulling back, dragging pebbles into the deep with a rhythmic, hollow rattle that sounded like a countdown. She stared out at the empty horizon, the same line she had watched for 20 years, but now it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. The vastness of the sea, once a source of quiet contemplation, had become a void. She stood motionless, her hands balled into fists at her sides, feeling the crushing pressure of the silence he had left behind. There was no movement on the water, no distant sail, no shift in the light to offer a distraction. Everything was static. Everything was gone. She remained anchored to the spot, the cold air numbing her face, waiting for a change that refused to arrive. The silence of the beach was shattered by a low, mechanical hum. It started as a vibration in the sand beneath her boots, then grew into the distinct roar of an engine tearing through the coastal road. Emily did not turn. She watched the waves, convinced the sound was merely a trick of the wind. The engine surged, then cut out with a sharp, metallic click. The silence that followed was different, heavy with intent. Footsteps crunched on the packed sand behind her, rhythmic and deliberate. They stopped only a few feet away. Emily turned. Daniel stood there, his breath visible in the cooling air. His hands were empty. He had not walked away from the car. He had walked away from the departure. She looked past him toward the road, where the car sat with its trunk still latched shut, holding the luggage he had refused to carry away. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. "I did not leave," he said, "because the best story I have ever written is you." Emily stared at him, her chest rising and falling in shallow, quick breaths. The air between them felt charged, stripped of the earlier cold. She looked at his hands, then back to his eyes, searching for the hesitation that had defined their final weeks. There was none. She took a half step forward, the sand shifting beneath her weight. The fear of the blank page, the fear of the horizon, the fear of the unknown, it all seemed to dissolve. "And how does the story end?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crashing waves. Daniel stepped into her space, his presence a solid anchor against the wind. He reached out, his fingers closing firmly around hers. The contact was warm, grounding, and absolute. "It ends happily," he said, his grip tightening as he pulled her slightly closer, "because we are writing it together." The tension that had held her rigid for years finally broke. She squeezed his hand back, her knuckles relaxing, and looked toward the town lights flickering in the distance. They turned their backs to the sea, the wind now at their shoulders instead of against them. The path toward the town lights was uneven, marked by the debris of the high tide and the soft, yielding texture of the wet sand. With every step, the distance between them closed until their shoulders brushed. They walked in a steady, synchronized rhythm, their movements no longer hesitant or searching. Behind them, the incoming tide surged forward, a white-foamed tongue of water licking at the beach. It swept over the sand with a soft, persistent hiss, smoothing the surface and erasing the two distinct sets of tracks they had left only moments before. Where there had been separate paths, there was now only a single, unified trail leading away from the water. Emily looked down at the ground, watching their shadows stretch long and thin against the darkening shore. The town ahead was no longer a place of isolation, but a destination they were building with every stride. They did not speak, the sound of the ocean providing a constant, rhythmic backdrop to their progress. The cold air no longer bit at their skin. It felt like a clean slate. As they reached the firm ground of the pier, the tide finally claimed the last of the beach, washing away the remnants of their solitary lives. They stepped onto the solid wood, their pace unhurried and sure. The horizon behind them was dark, but the path ahead was illuminated by the steady, warm glow of the town.